So welcome to this session today on education for democracy and democratic education. So I will introduce our first speaker now. We have Heather Ganshorn, who is the research director for Support Our Students Alberta, nonpartisan, nonprofit, public education advocacy group fighting for the rights of all children to an equitable and accessible public education system. SOS Alberta believes that when we meet the needs of the most vulnerable children, we elevate the quality of life for all children. We are a grassroots organization working with community organizers, activists, parents, students, educators, and general community members to protect the promise of public education as a public good and as a human right. SOS promotes and advocates for public education through an equity lens. Heather is also the parent of 2 children attending Calgary Public Schools. Her interest in education policy began when she registered her oldest child for kindergarten and started questioning why her excellent local elementary school ranked near the bottom of the Fraser Institute's list. Digging deeper generated more questions about many elements of Alberta's education system. A desire to connect with others who shared her concerns motivated Heather to join SOS Alberta as an advocate for public education. Heather believes that public education is essential to a functioning democracy. In her professional capacity, Heather is a research and instruction librarian at the University of Calgary. So please welcome Heather.
The reason I was invited here today is that I wrote a report for the Parkland Institute called Challenging Parental Rights. So they approached us and said, you know, we need somebody to break down these parental rights groups that people don't really know what they're about. So I wrote that report and I also presented a webinar on that. So I'm hoping not to cover too much of that same ground exactly today because that is available. Basically, we wanted to look at what is the sort of deep story of this parental rights movement and also what's wrong with parental rights. I mean, I'm a parent. I like to think I have rights. You know, it sounds like a good thing. So what is the problem? So looking at this movement, which is kind of a North American phenomenon, I'm not really aware of a movement like this in Europe, but definitely a fundamentally socially conservative movement, usually religiously conservative. There are a lot of diversity under the broad umbrella. So this group has done outreach with the Muslim community, but I think at its core, it is a fundamentally evangelical Christian sort of cultural preoccupation. That is where their intellectual core comes from. That is where I believe that, certainly in the US, that is where their money comes from. We don't know much about how these groups are funded in Alberta, but you can probably hazard a guess. This is very influenced by evangelical Christianity and Christian nationalism, which I'm sure a lot of you know what that is, but Christian nationalists are not just patriots who happen to be Christian or Christians who happen to be patriotic. They really subscribe to the view that America and Canada are fundamentally Christian nations, that they were founded as Christian nations, and that this has somehow been taken away and needs to be reclaimed. You see that in the sort of rhetoric of take back Alberta. Well, what are we taking it back from? We're taking it back from these secular people who want to de-Christianize us. There's some rewriting of history in that, to sort of imply that the founding fathers of the US were actually very Christian when a lot of them were actually interested in paganism and humanism and Enlightenment thought. So there is this narrative that really sort of flies in the face of what we think of as the separation of church and state, where it's no, there's no separation, or the separation was something that was introduced later that is wrong and must be reversed. It's overtly political. So again, I think a lot of us who grew up, I grew up in the United Church, which I've heard referred to as the Church of the 10 Suggestions. Very liberal, live and let live, it's cool to be something else, and it's a private thing. But the point of Christian nationalism is we must dominate the non-religious spheres of society. So this is sometimes referred to as the Seven Mountains Doctrine. I don't know has anyone heard of that? It is a strain within evangelical thought that says there are these metaphorical 7 mountains that Christians must take back. And those mountains are the family, religion, government, media, business, education, and culture. Those of you who were at Professor Ashley's talk this morning, they talked about how the anti-trans policy is often framed as pro-family, and a lot of the attacks on trans rights and reproductive rights are in the service of restoring that traditional family structure where like it's patriarchal and the father rules the head and the women have babies and the only sort of desirable option is heterosexual marriage and having children. But they are also very active in reclaiming education. And so in the US, we see this. It's laid out in Project 2025. This isn't like a hypothetical, yeah, this is what they would do if they could. They are doing it. They have taken over the government. Like Donald Trump's government is a Christian nationalist government. They are dismantling the Department of Education. They've taken over the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. They've bullied the Smithsonian into changing their exhibits. They've fired the Librarian of Congress. Like they're defunding public broadcasting. So this is very far along in the US, and I think there are people in Alberta who want to implement this very similar agenda. If you're interested in reading more about this movement, I really recommend Talia Lavin's Wild Faith. She talks a lot about the importance of education. They understand education as a socializing force. And so this is why, even though they argue on the one hand for school choice and being able to get public funding to send their kids to private religious schools, they are also not content to leave the public system that they've opted out of alone. And so in the US, parental rights groups like Moms for Liberty, they are very closely tied to the Republican Party and funded by massive, like the Coctopus, right? All these conservative organizations. So what does this have to do with Alberta? I would argue that in Alberta, these movements align more with their American peers than they do with any sort of Canadian cultural equivalent. And this is why, you see this in various, like the Alberta separatist movement is also kind of a 51st state movement, right? The culture of some of these groups is much more sort of internationalist. Actually, we were talking about internationalism the other day. They're doing it. The groups in this space are like, in Canada, it's Action for Canada, which was kind of arose up out of the convoy. Take Back Alberta, who I'm sure we're all somewhat familiar with. Parents for Choice in Education, and the Alberta Parents Union. So these groups have very close ties to the UCP. David Parker is the leader of Take Back Alberta, and they basically have taken over the board of the UCP. They hold most of the seats, they hold most of the local constituency associations, so they have this huge influence. Parents for Choice in Education is headed by a guy named John Hilton O'Brien. Incidentally, he's not a parent. You don't have to be a parent to care about the next generation, but when you are claiming to represent parents, it seems a little weird that you're not one. He is a former Wild Rose president, so, again, very close ties to Danielle Smith. The Alberta Parents Union is a bit of a newer group. I don't actually know why they felt the need to be separate from Parents for Choice, because they have all the same talking points. Parents for Choice is a little churchy, and the Alberta Parents Union presents a little bit more of a non-religious face, but their executive director also has close UCP ties. He's a guy by the name of Jeff Park, who actually was fined by Elections Alberta for his involvement in the so-called kamikaze leadership scandal. So these are all people who can pick up the phone and get a meeting with the minister. And actually in Alberta, the way things are supposed to work is that the parent voice should be represented by the Alberta School Councils Association. That is the designated group that represents, the parents of children in public schools, by which I mean public, Catholic, and Francophone, not just technically the public boards. This government doesn't seem to want to deal with those representative bodies. Instead, they kind of take meetings with these groups that are pursuing largely culture war issues. So book bans, pronoun policies, all the horrible stuff that we've seen happening lately. I think it's worth saying that there's some extreme and sometimes pretty violent rhetoric online from some of these folks. They do believe a lot of the conspiracy theories. I've been called a groomer and a pedophile because I advocate for public education. They believe the litter box in classrooms kind of conspiracy theory for students who identify as cats. They do feel, I think, that they have to be a little more subtle than in the US. They can't be as explicitly Christian. We are not all taking it as a given that we should have the 10 Commandments in every classroom. So they sort of resort to more dog whistle type language. And we saw this in the school board elections with some of those candidates just kind of putting it out there that maybe schools aren't really telling parents what's going on, and parents should have a right to know what's going on. One of their disinformation tactics too is to age things down to make things sound worse than they are. So we saw with the book ban that was in this implication that genderqueer is on the shelves of elementary school libraries, which it absolutely isn't. And none of us would support that, right? Like, I'm a librarian, I'm anti-censorship. I don't want that in an elementary school. Age appropriateness. And I can tell you also as a librarian that librarians apply collection development policies, and that would never be on the shelf of an elementary school. They do imply this, or, that children as young as 5 are being referred by their teachers for gender reassignment at the gender clinic. I mean, how does that even work? Are you getting a sub so you can take your kindergarten student to the gender clinic, and then that kid's not going to tell their parents what, just thinking through logically, this is not happening, right? But what is happening is mature minors do. There are a lot of youth in care, actually, trans youth, who have left their homes because their homes are not safe for them, and the parents are upset that these mature minors have access to medical care that the parents don't approve of. But it sounds more sensational when you age it down and say 5-year-olds. So my connection to this is really around concerns about privatization, which is what SOS is kind of all about. We believe in public education. We are concerned about the sort of systematic defunding of the public system as more dollars are diverted to private options. And in Alberta, if you've talked to any of the wonderful petition signature collectors outside, you know that private schools receive 70% of the per student base rate as public school students. It's kind of a funny way that the math works, actually. When students leave the public system to go to the private, it seems like that 70% follows them. But then they fearmonger about kids flooding back into the public system who somehow wouldn't be funded. So, it's kind of a selective narrative about how that funding works. We are also concerned about charter schools, which are 100% publicly funded, but very privately governed. And again, some very interesting characters have been approved for charter schools in the last few years, such as Kaylin Ford, who I'm not going to say much about because she's very litigious. She is now running a classical charter academy in Calgary and Edmonton. And if you want to know what classical charter schools are all about, Salon did an amazing series of articles on those. It's very much, that narrative of we're a Judeo-Christian nation and Western civilization. They kind of make alliances with people who are not necessarily on the religious right. People, I think, have really bought the line that education is a marketplace. You're made to feel like you're not really a good parent if you just sent your kid to their default public school. Didn't you even do any research? Why aren't you putting your kid in French immersion? Or, there's an art school in the neighborhood. Have you looked into that? Sue Winton, who has written a book about education privatization in Canada, pointed out that this is kind of part of the good parent narrative. Parents feel like they're being good parents when they try to secure advantages for their own children. And neoliberalism encourages us to focus on our own children and not on all children. And it is really hard to get parents to zoom out beyond their own kids. I think we've all found. So school choice is framed as this way to be a good parent and secure advantages, or if you're religious, to opt out of that public system that maybe doesn't reflect your values. To me, this parental rights movement is fundamentally anti-democratic. Professor Ashley really went into detail about this morning, fully covered in an excellent way. It's an inherently patriarchal, authoritarian, white Christian supremacist movement. Children don't have rights. I'm not kidding. You will see some of these folks on social media say, my child is my property. They have a property view of children. The US is the only country in the world that has not signed on to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and that is due to the evangelical lobby. Even though this is not a binding convention in any way, there's this real hostility to the idea that children have any kind of rights, a real lack of recognition of what the UN Convention calls the evolving capacities of the child. So that a 15-year-old actually can make some decisions about their own life, whereas a 5-year-old maybe not so much, might need more parental guidance. This movement claims to speak for all parents, but they don't speak for the parents of trans kids who want to help their kids. They don't speak for LGBTQ plus parents who want to see their family identities respected by the school, or for people who support human rights. They don't speak for me, and really, so it's not a very broad umbrella. They aim to shape public policy for public schools while also working to delegitimize, defund, and privatize public education. And I just think you don't have a democracy without public education at the end of the day. When you're opting out of public education, you're opting out of democratic participation. They use their access to government to shape policy without public consultation or input from any of the stakeholders that you would expect. So that book ban, the school boards didn't find out about it until they saw, either right before Nicolaides' press conference or during it. So Calgary and Edmonton issued a joint statement saying that they were caught off guard by this. So you're going around the actual democratic institution that is set up to manage public education because a special interest group called a meeting and also used a playbook. This is the Moms for Liberty playbook. It's always the same 5 books. They're always heavily LGBTQ plus content. They're graphic novels. The screenshots are already there. Why would you do your own work on this issue when you've just been handed a playbook to use? This is really a lobbying effort that was massively successful. Really advancing policies that violate basic human rights. Not just the rights of trans kids, by the way, who we absolutely should all care about, but any girl athlete now is potentially going to have her gender brought into question. If a parent on the other team decides that it wasn't fair that their team lost, and that girl, is she really a girl? Imagine being a 15-year-old girl and having to prove your biological sex. All these things are really, really bad, and they know they're bad, and that's why they're using the notwithstanding clause to advance these policies rather than see this play out in the courts. So let's talk for a second about safeguards, which is the slogan or motto of this conference, strengthening the safeguards. So what safeguards do we have at the intersection of education and politics? Let's look at these safeguards and how they're actually doing. So public school boards have had their powers significantly reduced or overridden by successive provincial governments. What does that mean? They've been told that they can no longer fire their members for code of conduct violations, such as Monique Lagrange's comparison of transgender activists to Nazis, which she was fired for, and this policy is a direct result of revenge over that. That's my opinion, allegedly. There's also other things being taken away from school boards. So the province very sort of quietly announced that they're going to own all the property now. New school builds will not be the property of school boards and an asset that they can use. It'll belong to the provinces. That's actually a huge change because municipalities and school boards usually own schools. It'll make it much easier for the province to switch this. Oh, now we're going to hand it over to a private school to operate because it doesn't actually belong to the public school board. These school boards are kind of weak, honestly. They seem very willing to comply with these terrible policies. Not a lot of public resistance. Even with the book ban, their chief complaint was, well, you didn't consult with us. It wasn't a defense, it wasn't an anti-censorship stance. It wasn't a defense of children's rights to read, to be represented in their school library collections. When you sort of talk to trustees in private about how weak this is, they tell you how helpless they are, which is very frustrating. But I will give a shout out to the Public School Boards Association of Alberta, who has really been doing some excellent work, quite quietly and just doggedly for years, really around privatization in particular, commissioning public policy research, doing some advocacy for public education as the most democratic form of education. Someone else mentioned unions. So how are organized labor doing these days?
Not so good.
Well, not great. ATA, legislated back to work with this very brutal use of the notwithstanding clause. The government wasn't even willing to go to binding arbitration because they weren't, which by the way usually favors the employer, but they weren't willing to even make any concessions. But the broader labor movement, I'm not quite sure where they're at, actually. There's talk of a general strike. There's talk of this resistance. We'll see what actually happens. I'm not real thrilled with the ATA. Arguably, they had no choice but to go back to work. But they did have a choice about whether they were going to participate on this ridiculous complexity task force where, they haven't been offered a seat at the table. They've been offered a seat at the children's table. You get one seat on this committee, and it's a non-voting seat. Why didn't they say, you know what, we don't believe this government is acting in good faith and we're not willing to be part of this? So yeah, organized labor not doing so great. My silver lining, though, not to be too much of a downer, is civil society. People in Alberta are waking up to the fact that no one's coming to save us. We are the ones we have been waiting for. This is why you see people rallying for public education. They weren't just rallying for teachers at the legislature. They were rallying for their kids' future. They are putting forward the recall petition for Nicolaides. They are putting forward the referendum for defunding private education. That is citizen action. Like, I don't even know who these people are, which is awesome. Like, for a long time, it felt like SOS was a lot of the, we've been saying these things for years, and now we're seeing all these people like doing it, which is incredible, actually. That is my big hope. Moving forward, I guess this is for more the Q&A and discussions session where I'm actually interested in people's comments, so please feel free. We have this civility paradigm for dealing with the government. We all want these things to succeed. We all care about public education. Well, they don't. They're trying to dismantle it. So this whole paradigm where it's like, let's work together on the issues we have in common is not working for us anymore. It's not working for school boards. It's not working for the teachers. So like, where do we go from here? I think we need to abandon the civility paradigm a little bit and be prepared to resist. And we need our safeguards to resist. So that's my thoughts. But like, I don't really know what that looks like. What do we replace this broken system with? And do we get more comfortable with being adversarial and just accepting that there's conflict in this relationship?
Thank you so much, Heather. And we'll move just right on to Carla Peck's session. Dr. Carla Peck is Professor of Social Studies Education in the Faculty of Education and Adjunct Professor in the Department of History, Classics, and Religion at the University of Alberta, and Adjunct Professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of New Brunswick. She is the Director of Thinking Historically for Canada's Future, a national SSHRC-funded partnership grant focused on K-12 history education in Canada. Dr. Peck researches teachers' and students' understandings of democratic concepts, teachers' and students' historical understandings, and is particularly interested in the relationship between students' ethnic identities and their understandings of history. Her latest book with Dr. Alan Sears is Rescuing Reason: How History Education Can Help Save Democracy. That's from the University of Toronto Press. Forthcoming spring 2026, so look for that to add to your bookshelves. Dr. Peck has provided professional development workshops for K-12 teachers in Alberta, across Canada, and internationally, and serves as a consultant on numerous boards and advisory groups for provincial, national, and international history and civic organizations. Dr. Peck.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much, Ricardo, for the invitation, and everybody at the Parkland Institute for having me here and for organizing a great conference. It's great to be here. And thanks to everybody in the crowd who's wearing red for Ed, which across the province, teachers and supporters of public education try to do every Friday. So when you get dressed next Friday, think about maybe wearing red as a little nod to that. The title of my talk comes in part from Jason Kenney. And you might be thinking, what? I'm going to focus on curriculum matters here in Alberta. A lot of my comments will refer specifically to the social studies curriculum because that's my area of expertise and that's what I have commented on mostly in the public sphere, although certainly the concerns and issues relate to curriculum more broadly. But a lot of my examples will be from sort of the social studies curriculum area. In 2019, the United Conservative Party took over the curriculum development process from the NDPs who had taken it over from the Progressive Conservative Party. And we immediately started to see the ideological slant with which the UCP was going to undertake curriculum revision in this province. And this ideological slant, of course, is not new. In 2016, the CPC National Convention, Jason Kenney claimed to his good friend Ezra Levant that schools were hardwiring students with collectivist ideas, and that we had to figure out a way, we being them, had to figure out a way to break that nut. And then at the UCP AGM in 2018, he very publicly declared, and I think he put it out on Twitter too, if the NDP tries to smuggle more of their politics into the classroom through the curriculum, we will put that curriculum through the shredder. And of course, that went to rousing applause at the AGM. In that moment, in 2018, just before they were elected, the curriculum was reframed on a political and ideological background. And so that's sort of the setting that we're working in here. When the UCP came to power, they immediately revised the ministerial order on student learning, which really sets the direction for education policy in the province. And I just have two examples compared to sort of illustrate this shift. In 2013, the ministerial order, which was written under a Conservative government, said in part, whereas education in Alberta will be shaped by a greater emphasis on inquiry, discovery, and the application of knowledge than on the dissemination of information. The idea was we want to tap into students' interests, we want to teach them how to research, how to investigate, how to be curious, and that education should not just be about the transfer, the banking model of education where you think you can open up a student's head and deposit knowledge into it. That was not what the intent was in the 2013 ministerial order. Compared to the new ministerial order that was put out in 2020, after a curriculum advisory panel was established to provide advice on what this new ministerial order should include. And the relative clauses here, students will inherit a rich, interconnected knowledge base. So gone is the idea that students should be inquirers, that they should be curious, and instead this is now about passing on a very particular set of knowledge, kind of knowledge, and I'll get into that, what that knowledge looks like in a few minutes. But you can probably guess, also based on some of what Heather had to say, about what kind of knowledge is considered valued and of most worth through the UCP lens. Which, by the way, what knowledge is of most worth is a classic curriculum question first asked by Herbert Spencer in the late 1800s. And so we're still asking that question. That question is still very much a lively debate. And this shift was a shift toward fixed truths over critical thinking and inquiry learning. And that is really reflected in the curriculum that we're seeing. This conference is all about safeguarding democracy, looking out for authoritarianism trends. Of course, one of those trends or tactics is excluding teachers and experts more broadly in whatever topic we might be, whether it's healthcare or education or other policy areas, the exclusion of experts. And that definitely happened in 2019 and onward when the UCP came to power in particular. Adriana LaGrange, who was the first Minister of Education with the UCP, tore up a partnership agreement with the Alberta Teachers Association, removing teachers from the curriculum development process. It was one of the first things that she did. Teachers were excluded from curriculum and advisory writing panels. Eventually, they had 19 people who were hired to write curriculum. Almost none of them had even a Bachelor of Education, never mind experience in the classroom. Teachers, curriculum experts like myself and other folks working in faculty of education were completely shut out of the process. Despite asking repeatedly, is there a way we could be involved? Can we support this work? Emails were not answered, or we were just told flat out no. Compare that to the process that the New Democratic Party undertook between 2015 and 19, where hundreds of educators were involved in the process. Every curriculum area, social studies, math, science, physical education and wellness, music, et cetera, each one had a team of about 50 people working on developing curriculum. And then there was another team of about 50 people, and I was on this second team for social studies. We were called sort of the validation group. We would read what the writing group had done and provide feedback, evaluate it, give suggestions on, what could be improved or strengthened, what was good already, and keep that, and, emphasize this more, that sort of thing. Not only that, the NDP engaged in widespread public consultation. Basically, anybody who wanted to get together a group of people to provide feedback on the curriculum could do that. There were toolkits available on the government website where if you wanted to provide feedback on the curriculum, whether you were a church group or a civic organization or a school board or whatever, there was a little toolkit you could use. Say, here, print out the curriculum. Here are some questions that can guide your discussion, and send it back to us. We want to hear from you. And so the process was very broad, transparent, it was iterative. They didn't just seek feedback once, it was sort of over and over again. They even published, they did surveys that they published on you could go and look, anybody with internet access could go online, find an Excel spreadsheet with 30,000 responses on it, and you could see, did a parent answer, was it a teacher, was it a community member, what have you, and you could see how they answered the various questions in the feedback. The process under the NDP was also aimed to be inclusive of marginalized voices and diverse perspectives. So on those writing groups and in the validation groups, you had representatives from public schools, charter schools, Catholic schools, independent schools, Indigenous sort of First Nations schools, et cetera, and members from Indigenous communities and LGBTQ2S+, and so lots of different voices at the table. That process wasn't perfect. 50 is a lot of people to try and write a document, and so that gets really complicated. It was also very slow, and one of the main criticisms of that process is they had a draft curriculum for kindergarten to grade 4, the NDP did, and it never got into schools because the process was just a bit too slow. And then an election happened, and boom, Kenny fulfilled the promise and put it through the shredder. When the curriculum was released, and here I'm going to speak mostly about social studies, but I will say the backlash against the curriculum across all subject areas was swift and it was fierce. Social studies and fine arts, and especially music, were particularly problematic in terms of racist content, stereotypical content, exclusion of women, exclusion of Indigenous perspectives. If Indigenous perspectives were included, various chiefs and Indigenous organizations across the province said, this is purely token representation. There's been nothing meaningful done to consult with us. The music curriculum, a very good friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Kathy Robinson, who studies world musics and engages in culturally responsive pedagogy, said the list of musics that they wanted students to learn were from sort of the Jim Crow era in the United States. And so those two areas received a lot of backlash in terms of racism, being grounded in Judeo-Christian sort of ideology, very white, inclusive of perspectives other than white Judeo-Christian. But all the subject areas received criticism from a wide array of experts. And to that end, this website, which is still live, the Alberta Curriculum Analysis, I went to my dean and said, we've got to do something to collate all of this analysis of the draft curriculum. So I led the development of this website, and you can go on it and look under subject areas, grade levels, and so on to see the various criticisms that have been done by different academics and other experts about the curriculum. 56 of 61 school boards refused to pilot the curriculum, and there were massive public protests and grassroots mobilization around it. I've already talked a little bit about this, but just to reinforce the fact that this curriculum, again, not only social studies, but other subject areas as well, received criticism because of the lack of inclusiveness or the very tokenistic window dressing form of inclusiveness that, it was really just performative and not meaningful. In this way, curriculum has really become a political weapon rather than a public good. It's being used to promote a certain view of what it means to be Albertan, what it means to be Canadian, and what that means is people who look like me, white, Judeo-Christian background, and anybody who doesn't look like me doesn't fit that picture, and therefore does not, count in terms of what it means to be an Albertan, what it means to be a Canadian. Many, many students in our classrooms will not see themselves reflected in the curriculum, whether they're from various ethnocultural groups, whether they have diverse gender identities, sexual identities, they are not going to see themselves represented in the curriculum. The delegitimization of teachers, scholars, and marginalized communities is another aspect of the authoritarian drift, and suppressing inquiry is also part of that in favor of fixed and sometimes distorted truths. And so this is also not new. And Heather, you referenced this, the attacks on the Smithsonian in the US, the idea that there is one true story of US history. Well, we also see that rhetoric and hear that rhetoric here in Canada. Jason Kenney lighting his hair on fire, that if you take Johnny MacDonald's name off a building, you're removing him from the annals of history. Well, no, nobody's saying Johnny MacDonald isn't going to be learned or taught about, but maybe we're not going to commemorate the guy who was responsible for residential schools and starvation of Indigenous peoples and this sort of thing. Maybe it's not okay to commemorate somebody like that right now, or maybe it never was. This is part of a larger pattern and authoritarian drift, certainly in North America. I have this example of the Florida, new history standard, a blow to our students and nation, where students are told and are to be taught that slavery was really good for some folks because they learned skills. That's a more recent development, but when Jeb Bush was the governor of Florida, they passed legislation saying that the history of the United States should be taught as fact and not an interpretation, which completely belies the actual nature of history as a discipline of inquiry. The shifts that we're seeing here towards authoritarianism definitely mirror broader shifts in the North American context. Public education and curriculum becomes an ideological threat for folks who don't believe in public education, who believe in privatization, who advocate parental rights, this distorted idea of parental rights. The attacks on social studies, history, and civic education in particular are strategic, because if you educate citizens who know how to advocate, who know how to think critically, who know how to stand up, say this is wrong, who know and learn and develop the cultural capital to be able to sign petitions, initiate petitions, recall petitions, and all this sort of thing, then that puts you as the person who doesn't like those things in danger. And it puts your ideology in danger. And so the attacks on social studies and civic education in particular are strategic. And also I include history in that because the idea that we might open up the historical narratives that students learn in schools to actually be inclusive of the reality of Canadian history, somehow some people interpret that as, well, you're taking away my history, rather than seeing it as an expansion of the stories that actually reflect the diversity of the Canadian population. You talked about the legislation, the book bans, trans rights, this kind of thing. This is about stoking fear and creating moral panic. And that's then used to justify state control. And then this constant bombardment that we have on every single front, education and healthcare and you name it, we become worn down, we become maybe compliant, or we just say, I don't know where to direct my attention anymore because there's just so many things that need my attention. When democratic education is under threat, which I think it definitely is in North America and including in Alberta, that leads to the elimination of inquiry, of questioning, of evidence-based reasoning, because it's It gets reduced in the curriculum. The curriculum is what is tested, and what is tested is often what is taught. In our social studies curriculum now, there are almost no skills. It's long lists of factual information. The items that are listed in the skills and processes column are things like discuss with a friend what it means to think about conflict in our society or something. It's not actually about developing critical thinking skills, creative thinking skills, historical thinking, geographic thinking, social participation skills for democratic dialogue. Those have been completely erased from the curriculum. The curriculum is also producing narrow identities and mythologized national history because of the narrowing of whose stories get to be told and get to be included in the curriculum. This reduces then students' opportunities to see themselves in the curriculum, as I've already mentioned. And this fundamentally undermines the pluralist aims of public education. So how can we respond? We've got to really not only reassert, but defend the democratic purpose of curriculum. And this is a shot from that massive rally at the end of October that I've heard different numbers. Somewhere between 25 and 40,000 people were there. We've got to advocate fiercely for transparent and inclusive development processes, especially around curriculum. We've got to mobilize and not let ourselves be fractured and by these different issues that keep coming up and taking our attention. And I think on the left, we have got to come together and say, all of these things are important and we're going to fight together to make sure we defend them. Whether your expertise is in healthcare or education or policing or whatever, we have got to not be fragmented. We've got to come together because it's the fragmentation they're counting on. It's the fragmentation they are counting on so that we just keep getting distracted and we don't have enough power because our fragmented groups are too small. So we've got to really mobilize. We've got to center voices that have not been centered previously. And we've got to use the thing that they hate, evidence, research, testimony, and public pressure to resist against regressive reforms. We've got to support teacher autonomy and professional expertise, promote inquiry and evidence-driven pedagogy, strengthen civic education focused on democratic skills and critical thinking. Do you recognize that guy? You got it. We've got to make sure students are at the table. Students are left out of almost everything, and including curriculum. They never have a chance to say, hey, this is the thing I'm interested in. And so Evan Lee, what an inspiration. I don't know if you heard him at the rally, but I mean, he just knocked it out of the park. We've got to do that, and we've got to create more Evan Lees of the world and provide space for them to have their voice and exercise their voice and build networks with other jurisdictions who are facing similar issues. Public schools are foundational democratic institutions. They cultivate civic literacy, empathy, and pluralism. They prepare students to challenge misinformation and authoritarian narratives. If they're well-funded and well-supported, and I truly, truly believe this, they have the power to be the great equalizer, including through the curricula that they teach. How can I talk about education without talking about John Dewey? Democracy has to be born anew every generation, and education is its midwife. And Paulo Freire. I mean, how can I talk about education without him? There's no such thing as neutral education. Education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity or freedom. This curriculum crisis that we're facing in Alberta and public education more generally, it's not isolated. It's part of a continental pattern. It's being used to reshape civic identity and political possibility. And so we need to take back that, and we need to say this is how we want it to shape civic identity and political possibility. Democratic backsliding is not inevitable. We can collectively safeguard public education by working together. And I'll leave you with this. A democratic society requires democratic schooling. Thank you.
Thank you so much to both of our speakers. We will open it up for discussion.
Thank you. That was great. I really enjoyed that. I was an EEA for 15 years, retired early because of problems that I was seeing in the classroom every day for the last 5 to 7 years, I would say. As far as one of the questions that I think it was Heather had, is resistance futile? I don't think so. I think it's what we have to do because everything else is not working. I have been involved in several rallies at the legislature, and I will continue to do that because I'm retired now, so I have the time. But it's something that's really important. Thank you.
Thanks for your thoughts. I really did want to hear from people who've been in the trenches, because I'm not, other than as a parent, and that resonates with me a lot.
There's actually a rally planned at where the UCP is having their AGM at the Edmonton Expo Center, and it's going to be all next weekend. So if anybody can come, we'd like thousands of people. That would be super. It's through the Civic Integrity Project, which is a grassroots organization based in Edmonton.
Heather, Carla, I actually have a question that I think is important to the conversation. One of the things I've been really worried about, and I think it's a tendency that's increasing in this time of sort of growing Canadian nationalism, is the tendency to attribute so much of this stuff to an import from the United States rather than something, as you addressed, Carla, as a continental tendency. From research from people like Barbara Perry, that Canada is an exporter of hate internationally, and actually one of the top exporters, that we export people like Jordan Peterson, but also on the internet. And also we know that from people on both sides of the conversation, from Diane Ravitch, but also from Ashley Berner, Alberta actually has had an immense influence on American education rather than the other way around. What I want to ask is, how do we start to think about this as a trend that's both continental and global, with our commonalities with other, sort of Commonwealth countries within the Anglosphere, with these different tendencies? You talked about internationalism, Heather. I'm worried that in this time that our activism is missing the fact that some of the calls coming from inside our house.
Yeah.
So
I think that's a really good point, and we know that some of the Proud Boys, their founder was Canadian, so I hear you. It's definitely bi-directional. I guess my thought is just, I hear from a lot of people, oh, but that's the US, it's not happening here. And it is happening here, and some of it is happening from here.
And it's a great point. As a history educator, I think one of the most important things we need to do is enlarge our historical consciousness and understanding about where these movements come from, that they are not only continental. I mean, there are history wars in Australia, too, against Three Cheers versus Black Iron Band history, which have turned into culture wars. We are situated in a larger context. 3 days ago, had someone said to me, "This is not the Alberta I know." And I'm like, well, where are you living then? Because, and this is a smart, educated, aware person, but it's like there's this unwillingness to admit that this problem is here and it's homegrown. What's that old adage? You can't fix it until you can admit there's a problem. And so we've got to kind of wake up the populace to say, yeah, it is here. A lot of it's starting here, and we can't address it until we face up to that reality.
As far as changes to the curriculum goes, I was wondering if you're aware of any attempts by the UCP to downplay or ignore things like evolution or Big Bang in science, or try to sneak in creationism through the back door, or to try to treat Bible history as like the flood as a literal history and teach that. Is there any sign of that they've been trying to do that sort of thing?
Not that I'm aware of, although I will say I haven't looked at the science curriculum intensely because my area is social studies, but I have not heard any of my science colleagues speak to that or raise that as a concern. But they are certainly narrowing what are considered the histories that are being taught in schools. I mean, some of the consultants they had when thinking about science, for example, the idea that there might be an Indigenous knowledges way of thinking about science, that wasn't ever really on the table. So the idea that there's only one way to think about science is an example of that sort of narrowing Western European sort of approach to thinking about curriculum.
I would just add to that there was a report released recently from the group for, I think it was For Our Kids, which is a environmental advocacy organization. It's called Polluting Education, and it looks at how deeply ingrained oil and gas messaging is in the curriculum.
My name is Jessie Mackay. I'm a consultant with Edmonton Public Schools, so I work with pedagogy in the elementary classroom. I can say that resistance looks different depending on where you stand. While teachers were definitely boots on the ground, sacrificing paychecks, taking abuse, which I need to say is 75% female. We're called the pink ghetto often. That was one representation of our resistance. The other representation is in how we interpret curriculum. And so my job is devoted to going into classrooms and working with teachers to interpret curriculum in a way that is hands-on, inquiry-based, and critically thinking. It's possible, and not only is it possible, but it's the norm, at least in Edmonton Public. We're not translating it in terms of knowledge comprehension. I needed to let you know that not all is lost, that how these institutions play out on a more granular level does have collective impact, if that makes sense. Nobody comes into our classrooms to say, hey, you are doing too much critical thinking. You are teaching the kids to question too deliberately. You are allowing them to develop conversational skills and voice their opinions and write letters to people too much. That's not happening. So that's an important thing to know, because I think we lose hope sometimes. At least I fight against losing hope all the time. I also wanted to thank you very, very much for saying that we need to capture student voices. This has been the problem from day one, for always. We are listening to the wrong people. The future does not belong to us. And these children are brilliant and see much more than we ever give them credit for. The last thing I just wanted to say was that in our resistance, the way we frame our arguments and our data really matters. I'm normally off social media, but this time has been particularly activating. And I wrote down a little post about my history. Both my grandmothers were teachers, both my grandfathers, farmers. And my mom was president of the ATA, so as a teenager, I grew up stoked in activism. Education has always been the lifeblood of social cohesion. Public education is the only pillar in our society where people from every single background, of every socioeconomic status, cultural background, political viewpoints, where we all are in the same space at the same time, learning a foundational knowledge that is common across all demographics. That argument of institutions strengthening social cohesion, I think, transcends political boundaries. I know that there is definitely a move to fracture, fragment, divide and conquer. But for those who are not yet aware of that, who are not yet awake to the sort of more nefarious influences upon us, explaining that fortifying our institutions serves us all, I feel like that could go a long way.
Maybe I'll just piggyback on that and ask, there's a lot of this talk around, parental rights, not a lot of sort of parallel talk around agency and autonomy of children themselves. Yeah. And Carla, you specifically said, students need to be engaged in all of these processes. If students were engaged in more of that planning and kind of background work, perhaps there would be more of a ceding of power to students. Students can do these things. They are intelligent. They do know what they're talking about. So what strategies could be used to actually engage students and youth into these conversations more fully? And maybe, too, there is an element there of, well, the more we engage students, the more they understand that their voice matters. And we don't, that is counterintuitive or antithetical to, like, an authoritarian approach to education, right?
There is very strong body of research that demonstrates that students who learn in classrooms where there's an open environment for discussion, dialogue, debate, where they learn how to talk with one another across varying perspectives, learn how to formulate arguments, defend arguments, listen to other arguments, and then process that, to respond, that those students are much more predisposed and to be engaged in civil society. When I've witnessed now the stripping away of of a coherent approach to skills teaching in the social studies curriculum, because it is really just a random list of, I mean, one of them was, draw a picture of an RCMP officer on a horse. As opposed to a really coherent scope and sequence of in grade 1, we should be teaching kids this kind of thinking and that kind of thinking and these kinds of communication skills, and in grade 3 and in grade, no sort of progression model for that, then that strips away the possibility for those students to actually learn the civic engagement skills that I think are really important and that I think our society really needs. Thank you for your comment about what teachers are doing in the classroom. I wholeheartedly agree. Teachers are the heroes, the unsung heroes, when they've been handed not only one curriculum, but a whole bunch of new curricular areas with very little to no professional development to actually try and figure out how to teach this new curriculum. No resources. I mean, the social studies curriculum resources are abysmal. I clicked on one link and it was a link to a scan of a photocopy from a Manitoba curriculum. One sheet. It's just insane how they are, sorry, that's ableist language. It was completely inappropriate how they are not resourcing this curriculum. But I will say that this government knows how to use fear very well, because we have had examples of when teachers are doing the very things that you're talking about, the next thing you know, the Minister of Education tweets out a worksheet or an exam question and says, what the heck are these teachers doing? It's not without risk that teachers are doing this work, and I think that's also important to acknowledge.
I just want to share a little anecdote. My next door neighbor is a retired social studies teacher, and we were talking about Evan Lee and these student walkouts that happened at high schools, and he's like, well, of course, they're all learning it in leadership class. That's another avenue, I think, where we are instilling democratic...
Extracurriculars.
Yeah, the extracurriculars. And I just want to mention also that there's currently a campaign called Vote 16 at the federal level that is aiming to lower the voting age to 16, and I'm all for that.
I don't have a question, I just have a comment. My name is Maisie. I'm the first vice president of Civic Service Union 52, a product of the Alberta education system. Me and my friends are doing okay. We are leaders in all types of industries, doctors, lawyers, teachers, nurses. That I might take some flack for this next comment, but because I had great teachers who encouraged critical thinking, I'm able to draw parallels to Nazi Germany and propaganda and this type of behavior, especially with our last municipal election. I also have 2 kids in the public education system, and the differences between my son, who was born in 2008, his education journey, and my child, who's born in 2012, are stark and glaring. That free speech and the critical thinking piece, and really taking that part away. So I do want to thank both of you for being here. Heather, the stuff we talked about this morning is heavy, and what I know at my core. And unfortunately, I'm a visible Muslim woman, as you can tell, and there is major disappointment within the religious leaders within my affiliations because they don't see it, they don't get it, and it's like, you're going to be next. They're coming for you too. It's only a matter of time. So sorry for my emotions. This is really, thank you both.
It is heavy.
It's so
I was
heavy.
very depressed working on that parental rights
heavy.
report. I have a transgender nephew, not in this province, thankfully. It's heavy, right?
So
it's
heavy.
hard.
So thank you both for all your work. Social studies teacher, love you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more, just this gentleman in the second row here.
In terms of the teachers, I'm the president of the Alberta Labour History Institute, and I did make a presentation to the teachers during the NDP period. There were about 90 teachers in the room. Largely what I was pushing was that you needed to talk about social class. You need to have much more in the curriculum about Indigenous people, racialized people, just women, that you had to represent everybody. And frankly, what I found is at a certain point, I was preaching to the choir, which made me think that in terms of teachers, isn't really the question now how they get to work around this shitty curriculum that's been put out, including, I know that the ATA leadership at the moment are kind of cowards, but isn't that something that, in fact, their union, the communities generally should be pushing. I mean, the right of the teachers and the kids to talk about real issues rather than do all this memory stuff, a lot of which is almost impossible at the grade level at which it's being presented.
Can I just float the suggestion that this terrible Jordan Peterson Act actually could be seen as a gift to teachers? They have said professionals should not be disciplined for expressing their opinion on issues. Viciously compliance that stuff.
The good news is, yes, it's a terrible curriculum, the worst I've ever seen. The first version was released, it was right at the end of March, and my friends in Quebec, who are professors of ed there, texted me and was like, is this an April Fool's joke, Carla? Because it was that bad. And of course, that version was ultimately repealed because of the fierce backlash that happened and public criticism. But the new one's not that much better. It really isn't. They've toned down some of the racist stuff, but it's still very much founded in Western, Judeo-Christian, white histories, perspectives, and so on. And it's still long list of facts and devoid of skills. The good news is the curriculum doesn't tell teachers how to teach. And so it says what you need to teach, but teachers can use and do use their professional judgment, their expertise, and how to bring life to a dead fish curriculum.
Okay, let us give another round of applause for our speakers. Thank you so much.